The rain came down in sheets, cold and sharp as splintered glass. It turned the canyon pass into a slick, churning river of mud and stone, and each clap of thunder sounded like the world cracking apart at the seams. Cora Layton clung to the horse's mane, her knuckles white, the fine silk of her wedding dress plastered to her skin like a cold, wet shroud. The delicate lace her mother had spent a fortune on, meant to grace the aisle of a Boston cathedral, was now a tattered ruin, ripped and stained by sagebrush and panic. The hem, once pristine, was shredded into brown ribbons that whipped against her bare ankles. She rode without a saddle, the animal's heaving sides slick with sweat and rain, its breath coming in ragged, panicked bursts that matched her own. Every shadow was a pursuing horseman. Every gust of wind was his voice, low and possessive, promising retribution. A flash of lightning bleached the canyon walls bone white, and for a heart-stopping second, she saw his face superimposed over the rock. George Dandridge, not the charming, respectable railroad magnate the world saw, but the man she had seen in private. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, held no warmth, only a chilling calculus. He was nearly twice her age, his face a mask of polite society that barely concealed the rot beneath. She could still feel the weight of his hand on her arm at the rehearsal dinner, his fingers digging in just enough to leave a mark, a silent warning. "You are a Layton," her father had told her, his voice thin and desperate, his eyes avoiding hers. "And the Laytons are in ruin? This marriage will save us. It will save everything." He had spoken of it as a duty, a noble sacrifice. But Cora knew it for what it was, a sale. She was property, a beautiful, well-bred commodity being traded to settle her family's catastrophic debts. Dandridge did not want a wife. He wanted an acquisition, another piece to add to his vast collection of companies and land and influence. He had looked at her not with affection, but with the cool appraisal of a man buying a prize mare. The thought of the wedding night, of being trapped in a room with that cold, cruel appraisal turning into something more, had been a physical chokehold. It had given her the strength of the truly terrified. While the guests drank champagne and toasted their good fortune, she had slipped out a side door, saddled the first horse she could find in the stables, and fled into the teeth of the approaching storm. She had not looked back. Now, hours later, the storm that had covered her escape had become her tormentor. The horse stumbled, its leg giving way on a loose patch of shale. It scrambled for purchase, groaning with effort, but it was spent. Cora slid from its back, her own legs buckling the moment they touched the ground. The world tilted violently, the gray sky and brown earth swirling into a nauseating blur. Her head throbbed, a sharp pain lancing through her skull where a low-hanging branch had struck her. She took a few staggering steps, her bare feet cut and bruised, before her body finally betrayed her. She collapsed into the mud at the edge of a place that was little more than a collection of weary, slumped buildings huddled against the canyon wall, a weathered sign. Its letters faded nearly to oblivion. Read, Whiskey Ridge, population, barely. The last thing she saw before the world went black was the unrelenting, merciless sky. Eli Ward found her on his way back from checking his southern fence line. It was his dog, a scruffy gray mutt named simply Dog, who noticed her first. The animal stopped dead, a low growl rumbling in its chest, the hair on its neck bristling. Eli reined in his buckskin, his eyes scanning the terrain. He was a man who moved with a deep, ingrained quiet, a stillness learned from years of solitude and the kind of violence that teaches a man to listen more than he speaks. He saw the heap of white against the dark mud, and his hand instinctively went to the worn grip of the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. Trouble always found him, and a woman in a wedding dress lying half dead at the edge of town was a special kind of trouble. He dismounted, his boots making no sound on the wet ground. As he drew closer, he saw she was no painted lady from the saloon. The dress, though ruined, was made of a fabric finer than anything in Whiskey Ridge, maybe finer than anything in the whole territory. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was matted with blood and mud. A long, angry gash ran from her temple into her hairline. She was breathing, but it was shallow, almost imperceptible. He knelt beside her, his movements economical. He saw the softness of her hands, the elegant line of her jaw. She was from back east, that much was clear, and she was running from something awful. For a long moment, he considered riding on. He had enough ghosts of his own. He did not need to take on anyone else's. Bringing her into his life was a risk. People in town already looked at him sideways, whispering about the things he had done during the war and the years after. A woman like this would only give them more to talk about. But then she moaned, a sound so faint and lost it snagged on something inside him he thought had died long ago. He looked at her pale face, at the vulnerability in the line of her throat, and cursed under his breath. He could not leave her for the coyotes. With a grunt of resignation, he lifted her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing. He laid her gently across the front of his saddle, mounted up behind her, and guided the buckskin toward the faint trail that led to his cabin, tucked away in the high rocks where no one ever bothered him. His home was a small, solid structure built of pine and river stone, with a lean-to for his 2 horses and a porch that overlooked the vast, unforgiving expanse of the West. It was a place of solitude, not comfort. Inside, it was spare and clean. A narrow cot, a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and shelves holding a few books, tins of coffee, and bags of flour and beans. He laid her on his own cot, the only soft place in the cabin, and Dog immediately settled on the floor beside her, watching with intelligent, wary eyes. Eli worked with a practiced efficiency. He fetched a bucket of water from the rain barrel and, with a clean rag, began to gently wash the mud and blood from her face. Her skin was so pale he could see the faint blue veins beneath it. She stirred as he cleaned the gesh on her head, her eyelids fluttering, her eyes opened, a startling, deep shade of blue, wide with confusion and then a sharp spike of fear. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice raspy. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness sent her falling back. "Lie still," he said. His voice was low and gravelly from disuse. "You took a bad fall." She stared at him, taking in his worn denim, the beard-stubbled jaw, the deep lines etched around his eyes. He saw the fear in her gaze solidify into a specific terror. To her, he was just another threat, a rough, dangerous man in a rough, dangerous place. He could not blame her. "Where am I?" she asked, her hand instinctively going to the collar of her dress, as if to hide its incriminating elegance. "My cabin. You were outside of town." He did not offer his name. He did not offer any comfort beyond the facts. "You need to rest." He moved to the fireplace to build a fire, turning his back to her to give her a moment. The air in the small cabin was thick with a tense, guarded silence. He was a man who knew the 100 different sounds of the wilderness, the rustle of a snake in the dry leaves, the far-off scream of a mountain lion, the subtle shift of the wind before a storm. But the sound of this woman's soft, ragged breathing was a foreign country. He assumed she was trouble. A woman who ran from her own wedding was running from a man, and a man who could afford a dress like that was a man with power and reach. Cora, for her part, saw only a stranger who looked as hard and unforgiving as the land itself. The way he moved was quiet, almost predatory. The cabin, though clean, felt like a cage. She was trapped, her body too weak to flee, her situation more desperate than ever. He was dangerous. Every instinct she had screamed it. But she was also exhausted, and the growing warmth from the fire he was building began to seep into her chilled bones, a simple, undeniable comfort that she could not refuse. The days that followed were a silent, watchful dance. Eli tended to her wound, changing the dressing with hands that were surprisingly gentle. He would leave broth and hard biscuits by the cot before he left each morning, and he would return at dusk, smelling of dust and horse and pine. He rarely spoke, and when he did, It was in short, clipped sentences. "Eat," he would say, nodding at the food, or, "How's the head?" Cora's strength slowly returned, but her silence remained. She could not tell him the truth. To speak the name Dandridge was to summon him, to put this man, whoever he was, in the path of a ruthless force, and she could not bear to speak of her family's betrayal. The shame was a physical weight in her chest, so when he asked her what had happened, she simply shook her head. "I got lost." He did not press her, but she could feel his skepticism, her cultured speech, the way she held herself even in her ruined dress, her soft, uncalloused hands. They all told a story she was refusing to voice. She was a lady, and ladies did not get lost in the Western Territories dressed for a wedding. The land itself seemed to be a part of him, a constant, menacing presence. At night, the coyotes would begin their yipping, mournful calls, a sound that made the fine hairs on Cora's arms stand on end. Eli seemed not to notice. Once, while she was sitting on the porch, a rattlesnake coiled in the dust nearby, its tail a dry, buzzing whisper of death. Before she could even scream, Eli was there, the Colt in his hand, a single shot ending the threat with an almost casual finality that terrified her more than the snake had. He simply nudged the dead creature aside with his boot and went back to cleaning his rifle, his face impassive. The heat of the day was a dry, suffocating blanket that gave way to a sudden, bone-aching frost the moment the sun dipped below the mountains. This was a land of extremes, and the man who had saved her seemed to be carved from it. He noticed things. He saw the tremor in her hands when she tried to pour herself a cup of water. He heard the muffled sobs that shook her body in the dead of night when she thought he was asleep. He saw the way she jumped at the sound of approaching hoofbeats, her body going rigid with a stark, hunted terror. This was more than a lost bride. This was a woman who was afraid for her life. The question was, from whom? After a week, her supplies of broth were gone, and Eli announced they had to go to town. "You can stay here if you want," he said, his back to her. It was not a question. "No," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I will come with you." She could not stand the thought of being alone, of someone arriving while he was gone. Whiskey Ridge was even more desolate up close. It was a town dying on its feet. The mine had played out years ago, and only the most stubborn or desperate souls remained. A general store, a saloon, and a blacksmith were all that was left of its former life. As they walked down the dusty main street, people stopped and stared. A woman in a borrowed man's shirt that was far too big for her, her face bruised and her hair cut short where Eli had trimmed it away from the gash, walking beside the silent, brooding Eli Ward. It was a scandal made manifest. A group of ranch hands were leaning against the front of the general store, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. One of them, a big man with a greasy hat and a leering grin, nudged his friend. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. Ward," he called out, his voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Heard you found yourself a pretty little stray. Looks like she's seen some hard miles." Cora flinched, her face burning with shame. She tried to shrink behind Eli, to disappear. Eli stopped walking. He did not raise his voice. He did not draw his weapon. He simply turned and looked at the man. His eyes, which Cora had thought were merely distant, turned as cold and flat as river stones in winter. "Her name is none of your concern." "Jeb," Eli said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "And if I hear you speak another word about her, I will pull your tongue out through the back of your neck. You understand me?" The man's smirk vanished. He had seen Eli in a fight once, a brutal, terrifying display in the saloon years ago. He paled, swallowed hard, and gave a jerky nod. "Sure, Eli, no offense meant." Eli held his gaze for another long second before turning and ushering Cora into the store. The other men shuffled away, suddenly finding other places to be, inside. Cora's hands were shaking. She had seen him as a threat, a captor. But out there, In the street, his violence had been a shield. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something else beneath his aloof exterior, a fierce, unnerving protectiveness. They gathered their supplies in silence and rode back to the cabin as the sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The beauty of it felt like a mockery. That night, after Eli had turned in, Cora could not sleep. The whispers of the townsfolk echoed in her ears. She slipped out of the cabin and stood on the porch, wrapping her arms around herself against the creeping cold. The sky was a vast, dark blanket pricked with a million impossibly bright stars. There was no moon. It was a lonely, terrifying, and beautiful sight. She felt utterly, completely alone, a ghost haunting a life that was not her own. She thought of her family, who had sold her. She thought of Dandridge, who was surely hunting her. And she thought of the silent, scarred man sleeping just a few feet away, a man who was both her captor and her protector. A tear slipped down her cheek, hot and then instantly cold in the night air. She looked up at the indifferent stars, at the endless, empty darkness, and whispered the words of a prayer she did not know she had. "Please," she breathed into the vast silence, her voice breaking. "Please do not let me go." The silence in the cabin was a living thing, a third presence that sat at the table with them and watched them from the shadowy corners. For Cora, it was a vast improvement over the brittle, forced chatter of her previous life. But it was an unnerving quiet all the same. She could not bear to be idle, to be nothing more than a patient recovering on the man's cot. She had to earn her keep, prove she was not the useless burden she felt herself to be. And so, she began to try. Her first attempt was with the small flock of chickens that scratched a living in the dust behind the cabin. They were scrawny, cantankerous birds, and they scattered in a squawking frenzy when she approached with the grain. She, who had been taught to pour tea from a silver pot without a single tremor, found herself flinging the feed with a clumsy, jerky motion that sent more of it into the dirt than into the chicken's reach. From the doorway of the lean-to where he was mending a bridle, Eli watched her. He said nothing. He simply observed her futile efforts, his face a mask of neutrality. After a few minutes of her flustered attempts, he walked over, took the sack of grain from her unresisting hands, and with a low, gentle whistle and a flick of his wrist, cast the feed in a perfect arc. The chickens, suddenly calm, flocked to it. He handed the sack back to her and returned to his work without a single word. The gesture was not unkind, but it left her feeling small and utterly inept. It was the same with the kindling. She found the small hatchet he used and tried to imitate the way she had seen him split small logs for the fire. Her hands, soft and accustomed to embroidery needles and the ivory keys of a pianoforte, were not made for the rough, unforgiving handle of an axe. The blade glanced off the wood, biting into the chopping block with a jarring thud that sent a shock up her arms. She tried again, bringing the hatchet down with more force, but her aim was poor and the blade hit the wood at a foolish angle. A sharp splinter flew up and stung her cheek. She cried out, more from frustration than pain, and dropped the hatchet. Once again, he was simply there. He had moved so quietly she had not heard him approach. He took the hatchet from the ground, his large, calloused hand dwarfing the handle. He did not look at her. He placed another log on the block, and with 3 short, precise motions, thwack, 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 he split it into a dozen perfect pieces of kindling. He stacked them neatly, then turned and walked away. His quiet competence was a constant, unspoken commentary on her own uselessness. The coffee was her greatest shame. She watched him make it each morning, a ritual of spooning dark grounds into the pot, adding water from the bucket, and setting it on the grate over the fire. It seemed simple enough. One morning, she woke before him, determined to have a hot cup waiting for him when he rose, but she misjudged the heat of the coals. A foul, acrid smell soon filled the cabin. When Eli emerged from the small side room where he now slept on a bedroll, he found her staring in dismay at the pot, which was bubbling over with a black, tar-like substance. A cloud of bitter smoke hung in the air. He looked at the pot, then at her crestfallen face. For the first time, she thought she saw the corner of his mouth twitch, not in a sneer, but in something that might have been the distant cousin of a smile. He took the pot, carried it outside to dump the burnt mess, and started over. "Less fire," was all he said. These moments became the rhythm of their days. Her fumbling attempts, his silent corrections. A tension simmered between them, thick and heavy in the small space. It was a strange intimacy, built not on words but on shared solitude and unspoken observations. She learned the sound of his footsteps, the way he held his shoulders when he was tired, the deep sigh he would let out at the end of the day when he thought she could not hear. He, in turn, learned the patterns of her grief. He would see her staring out at the vast, empty horizon, her eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to have no bottom. He grew accustomed to the sound of her crying in her sleep. Night after night, small, desperate sobs would escape her lips, her hands clutching at the blankets as if trying to fight something off. In those moments, he would lie perfectly still on his bedroll, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists. He would look away, staring into the darkness of his own room, granting her the privacy of a grief he did not understand but could feel in the very air of the cabin. A part of him, the part that had been a soldier, a protector, wanted to go to her, to offer some kind of comfort. But he knew that his touch would be a trespass. He had seen the way she flinched if he accidentally brushed against her when passing the table. It was a small, almost imperceptible recoiling, but it was there. She was a frightened deer, and he was a wolf, and they both knew it. His own nights were not much better. The quiet of the cabin was a breeding ground for ghosts. Sometimes, the smell of the pine logs burning in the hearth would transport him back 20 years. He was no longer a man in his 30s, but a boy of 15, standing helpless as men in gray uniforms put a torch to his family's homestead in Missouri. The memory was not a story he could tell. It was a physical sensation. He could feel the heat on his face, smell the sickening scent of burning timber and scorched earth, and hear the high, frantic screams of the horses trapped in the barn. He could see his father's face, grim and defiant, just before they shot him. And always, there was Samuel, his younger brother, barely a man, with a laugh that could charm the birds from the trees. Eli saw him in flashes, a recurring nightmare that had followed him for 2 decades. The chaos of a Confederate ambush in a Tennessee wood, the crack of rifles, the smell of gunpowder and blood, the panicked, confused shouting, and Samuel lying in the mud, his eyes wide with surprise, a dark red stain spreading across the front of his butternut shirt. Eli had held him, had tried to plug the wound with his own hands, but it was like trying to stop a river. Samuel's last breath had been a whispered, questioning, "Eli?" as if he could not quite believe what was happening. Eli had carried that question with him ever since. The guilt was a stone in his gut, a constant weight that reminded him that everyone he had ever tried to protect was gone. He looked at the woman sleeping on his cot, at her fragile peace, and saw only another potential failure, another life he could shatter. One evening, as she was helping him shell beans, her hands moving with a slow, unpracticed rhythm, she finally offered him a piece of her story. "I was to be married," she said, her voice quiet, her eyes fixed on the bowl in her lap. "It was an arrangement. My family, they needed it, but I could not go through with it. He was not a kind man." Eli kept his gaze on his own work, his thumb methodically splitting open the pods. "Most men with money ain't," he said, his tone flat. He knew there was more to it. He could hear it in the careful, clipped way she spoke, in the things she was leaving out. But he did not ask. It was her story to tell, or not tell. Her confession, small as it was, hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their silence. Their next trip to Whiskey Ridge was worse than the first. The whispers were louder now, the stares more hostile. As they entered the general store, the proprietor, Mr. Henderson, a man with a sour face and thinning hair, looked up from his ledger. His wife, a pinched, severe-looking woman, stood behind the counter. "Morning, Eli," Henderson said, his voice holding no welcome. His eyes slid over to Cora, and his expression curdled into one of open disapproval. "Henderson," Eli replied, nodding curtly. He placed his list on the counter. "Need these things. Mrs. Henderson folded her arms across her chest. "We don't serve her kind here," she said, her voice sharp and righteous. Cora froze, the blood draining from her face. She felt as if she had been slapped. Eli's posture did not change, but a dangerous stillness settled over him. "Her kind," he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "You know what I mean. Ward," the woman snapped. "Bringing a ruined woman into your home. It is a disgrace. We are decent folk here. We will not have it." "Ma'am," Eli said, his eyes locking onto hers. "You do not know a thing about this lady, and you are going to fill my order, or I will take what I need and leave you what I think it is worth." Mr. Henderson paled. "Now, Eli, there is no need for threats." "Was not a threat," Eli said calmly. "It was a statement of fact. Now, are you going to sell me my supplies, or am I going to take them?" The store was silent for a long, tense moment. Finally, with a resentful sniff, "Mrs." Henderson began to gather the items on the list, slamming them onto the counter with a deliberate force. Cora stood by the door, humiliated, wishing the floor would swallow her whole. The trouble she had fled had followed her, and now it was splashing onto the one person who had shown her any measure of decency. The ride back to the cabin was heavy with her shame. When they arrived, she could not bring herself to go inside. She stood by the corral, watching the horses. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. Eli came and stood a few feet away, leaning against the fence. "I should go," she said, her voice thick. "All I have done is bring you trouble. I have shamed you in front of this whole town. I will not be the cause of your ruin." Eli was quiet for a long time, looking out at the mountains. "This town does not get to decide who is ruined and who is not," he said finally, his voice rough. "They made up their minds about me a long time ago. What they think does not matter." He turned to look at her, his gaze direct and steady. "You did not ask for any of this. The fall, this town, none of it. You do not run from it." His words were not gentle, but they were firm, a solid wall against her despair. He was not offering pity. He was offering something far rarer, resolve. She looked at him, at the hard lines of his face, and felt a profound and unexpected surge of gratitude. She nodded, unable to speak, and went inside the cabin. That night, the sky broke open. The storm rolled in from the north, a black wall of clouds that swallowed the stars. The wind came first, a low moan that grew into a frantic shriek, rattling the single window in its frame. Then came the rain, hammering against the roof like 1,000 angry fists. Lightning spider-webbed across the sky, followed by claps of thunder so loud they seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. The storm outside was a mirror of the tempest inside Cora's mind. She was asleep, but not at peace. She was back in Boston, in the suffocatingly ornate parlor. George Dandridge was there, his voice a low, menacing purr as he detailed all the ways he would destroy her family if she disobeyed him. He reached for her, his fingers like steel bands on her arm, and his face twisted into a cruel smile. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The thunder from the world outside became his enraged shouting in her dream. She woke with a strangled gasp, sitting bolt upright on the cot. Her heart was pounding, a wild bird trapped in her ribs. Tears streamed down her face, hot and fast. She was sobbing, deep, shuddering breaths that she could not control. The nightmare clung to her like a shroud, its terror real and immediate. The cabin door creaked open, and Eli was there, a silhouette against the flashes of lightning. He did not light a lamp. He crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt beside the cot. "You are all right," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the roar of the storm. "It was just a dream."
"It was not,"
she sobbed, burying her face in her hands.
"It was a memory."
He hesitated for only a second. Then, he sat on the edge of the cot and did what he had wanted to do for weeks. He reached out and pulled her against him, his arms circling her trembling body. It was not a lover's embrace. It was the hold of a man anchoring a drowning woman. She collapsed against his chest, her small frame racked with sobs, and he just held her, one hand stroking her hair, the other pressed firmly against her back, as if he could physically hold her together. He was acutely aware of everything about her, the scent of soap and sorrow, the softness of her hair against his rough cheek, the desperate way she clung to his shirt. A fierce, protective instinct rose in him, so powerful it almost stole his breath. But it was tangled with something else, a deep, pulling hunger that he had buried long ago. He tried to ignore it, tried to wall it off, focusing only on the rhythm of her breathing as it slowly, gradually, began to calm. After a long time, her sobs subsided into quiet sniffles. She did not pull away. Instead, she seemed to press closer, burrowing into the warmth and solidity of him.
"I am sorry,"
she whispered against his chest. "Nothing to be sorry for." She was quiet for a moment, listening to the rain on the roof and the steady, reassuring beat of his heart beneath her ear. "I feel safe," she said, her voice full of a quiet wonder. "I cannot remember the last time I felt safe." Her words hit him harder than a physical blow. Safety was not something he dealt in. He was a man who brought danger, who lived with ghosts. To have this woman find refuge in his arms felt like a profound and terrible mistake. He should let her go, stand up, and retreat to the other side of the room. But he could not. Her trust was a fragile, unexpected gift, and he found himself unwilling to set it down. When the storm finally began to recede, leaving behind a steady, gentle drumming on the roof, he loosened his hold. She looked up at him, her face pale in the faint gray light that filtered through the window, her blue eyes dark and luminous with unshed tears. They were on the porch, the air cool and clean after the rain. The world smelled of wet dust and sage. They had moved out there without speaking, as if they both needed the open space after the intensity in the cabin. He looked at her mouth, soft and vulnerable. He thought of all the reasons he should not. He was too old for her, too broken. His past was a wasteland, and he had nothing to offer her but more trouble and more sorrow. He was not a man who should touch someone so fine, so wounded. But the hunger, the deep, lonely ache inside him, was a tide that had been rising for weeks, and her confession of safety had been the final thing to breach the walls he had built around his heart. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. She watched him, her eyes wide, her lips parting slightly. Their first kiss was not a crash of passion, but a soft, tentative exploration, barely a whisper of lips. It was hesitant, uncertain, freighted with all the unspoken fear and loneliness that had filled the spaces between them. It was a question asked in a language neither of them had spoken in a very long time. It lasted only a moment before Eli pulled away, a harsh, ragged breath escaping his lungs. Guilt washed over him, cold and sharp. He stood up, turning his back to her, and stared out at the dark, dripping landscape. "I am not a man who should touch you," he said, his voice raspy with self-loathing. He heard her stand, heard the soft shuffle of her bare feet on the wooden porch behind him. He expected her to go inside, to retreat from the line he had just crossed. Instead, she spoke, her voice quiet but clear in the rain-washed air, a question that stripped away all of his defenses. "Then why?" she asked. "Does it feel like I've been waiting to be touched by someone like you my whole life?" Cora's question hung in the cool, damp air between them, more intimate and revealing than the kiss itself. It was a question Eli had no answer for, a truth he could feel in the marrow of his bones but could not articulate, before he could find the words, or perhaps find the will to retreat. The first rays of dawn began to bleed over the distant mountains, diluting the darkness and ending the strange, fragile truce the night had offered. The moment was broken. He took a step back, the space between them suddenly feeling like a vast, dangerous canyon. He gave a curt nod, turned, and went to tend to the horses, leaving her alone on the porch with the scent of rain and the ghost of a question that would follow them both through the long, bright day. The fragile peace their kiss had promised was shattered 2 days later. Eli had ridden into Whiskey Ridge for salt and flour, a necessary trip he now dreaded. The town felt like a collection of hostile eyes, and he felt the weight of their judgment not for himself, but for Cora. As he was tying his horse to the hitching post outside the general store, Silas, the town's blacksmith, came out of his workshop, wiping soot from his hands on a leather apron. Silas was a man of few words, and his face was set in a permanent scowl from years of staring into a forge. But his eyes were sharp. "Ward," he grunted, nodding toward the saloon. "You ought to know. There is a man in there. Been asking questions." Eli's body went still. "What kind of man?" "Not our kind," Silas said, and that was all the explanation needed. "Dressed fine, hands have not seen a day's work, smells of bay rum. He is a city man, a Pinkerton. Maybe he is looking for a runaway bride, offering a reward that could buy this whole sorry town twice over." A cold knot formed in Eli's stomach. Did he give a name? "He did," the blacksmith said, his eyes holding Eli's. "The girl's name, Cora Layton." Eli did not react. His face remained a mask of stone. But inside him, something cold and heavy began to sink. He had known she was trouble. He had not known the scope of it. A reward that size meant the man she was running from was not just wealthy. He was powerful, and powerful men did not take kindly to being defied. He bought his supplies, his movements clipped and efficient, and rode out of town, the blacksmith's warning echoing with every hoofbeat. When he returned to the cabin, Cora was on the porch, attempting to mend a tear in one of his shirts with a clumsy but determined focus. She looked up and smiled when she saw him, a real, unguarded smile that lit up her face and made his heart ache. The smile faltered when she saw his expression. "What is it?" she asked, putting the shirt aside. "What is wrong?" He dismounted and came to stand before her, the dusty supplies still in his hand. "There is a man in town," he said, his voice flat. "A bounty hunter. He is looking for you." All the color drained from her face. She looked, in that moment, like the half-conscious girl he had found in the mud, all the strength and resilience she had gathered over the past weeks vanishing like smoke. Her hands flew to her mouth, and a small, wounded sound escaped her. "He knows my name?" she whispered. "He does," Eli said, his voice grim. "Which means the man you ran from knows where you ran west. It was only a matter of time." She sank onto the porch steps, her head in her hands. He could see her shoulders shaking. He wanted to reach out, to comfort her as he had during the storm. But his own mind was racing. He was harboring a fugitive, a woman whose fiancé had enough money to hire Pinkertons and offer fortunes for her return. This was not just trouble. This was a death sentence, for her and for anyone who stood with her. "You have to tell me everything," he said, his tone harder than he intended. "No more half-truths. I need to know exactly who is coming for you." She looked up, her eyes swimming with tears, but also with a new, desperate resolve. "His name," she said, her voice trembling but clear, "is George Dandridge." The name meant nothing to Eli, but he could see the terror it held for her. "He is not just a railroad magnate," she continued, the words spilling out of her now, a torrent of confession. "He is a collector. He collects companies, land, politicians, and he collects beautiful things to display. My family was on the verge of collapse. My father's shipping business was ruined. Mr. Dandridge offered to save them, in exchange for me." She stood up and began to pace the small porch, her movements frantic, like a caged animal. It was a business transaction, but he made it seem like a fairy tale to the world. In private, he was different. There is a coldness in him. Eli, a cruelty. He enjoys control. He would hold my arm just a little too tight. His voice would drop to this whisper, and he would tell me about the corrections he had to make with his first wife, who died so young. He told me that a wife is a reflection of her husband, and she must be polished to perfection. He said he would ruin my father, my mother, my younger sisters. He would cast them into the streets and ensure no one in Boston would ever offer them so much as a piece of bread. He swore it. I was trapped. Eli listened, a lethal stillness settling over him. He had known violence his whole life, the open, bloody violence of the battlefield, the brutal, desperate violence of a saloon brawl. But this was something else. This was a quiet, suffocating poison, wielded behind closed doors by a man who wore the mask of respectability. "So you ran," he said. "On my wedding night," she confirmed, her voice cracking. "I could not do it. I could not let him own me. I would rather die out here than spend a single night as his wife." The confession lay between them, stark and ugly. Eli finally understood. Dandridge was not a man who would simply take his bride back. He was a man who would punish her for her defiance. He would make an example of her, and Eli, by taking her in, had placed himself directly in the path of that cold, methodical rage. His first instinct was survival, not just for himself, but for her. "You cannot stay here," he said, his voice rough. "He will find you. His money can buy the law in this territory. It can buy men to hunt you down. I can give you a horse and supplies. You can ride north, lose yourself in the mountains." Cora stared at him, her expression shifting from terror to disbelief, and then to a deep, wounded anger. "You are sending me away?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "I am trying to keep you alive," he countered, his own frustration rising. "No," she said, taking a step toward him, her eyes flashing. "You are pushing me away. I just told you the ugliest truth about myself, and you are telling me to leave. Is it because I am ruined? Because I am too much trouble?" "This has nothing to do with that," he bit back, stung by the accusation. "This has to do with a man who will burn this cabin to the ground with both of us in it to get what he wants. I cannot protect you from that." The ghost of his brother Samuel rose in his mind, his face pale, his eyes full of surprise and fading light. "I cannot protect you." "So you will do nothing?" she demanded. "You will just send me out there to die alone?" "You are twisting my words," he said, his voice rising. "You showed up on my doorstep, a ghost in a wedding dress, and I took you in. I have fed you, protected you. Do not stand there and tell me I am doing nothing." "And what was I to you?" she shot back, her voice breaking. "A stray dog you felt sorry for? A secret to keep in your cabin? Or was I just a place for you to hide from your own loneliness for a few weeks?" The accusation hit him like a physical blow, because it held a sliver of truth. "Do not pretend you were not doing the same," he retorted, his words cruel because he was lashing out at his own fear. "You are using me as a hiding place, a wall to put between you and Dandridge, and now that wall is not high enough, so it is time to find another one." The words, once spoken, could not be taken back. They hung in the air, ugly and venomous. Cora flinched as if he had struck her. The anger in her eyes was replaced by a profound, shimmering hurt. She looked at him for a long moment, her chin trembling. "Fine," she whispered. "Fine. I will not be a burden to you any longer." Before he could respond, before he could apologize for the words he had not meant, she turned and fled. Not into the cabin, but out toward the open country, running blindly, her borrowed shirt flapping around her. "Cora!" he yelled, starting after her. But she was fast, fueled by pain and a desperate need to escape the crushing weight of his rejection. At that same moment, the world began to change. The sky, which had been a clear, hard blue, was turning a sickly shade of yellow on the western horizon. The wind picked up, carrying with it a strange, mournful hiss. A dust storm. He had seen them before. They could rise up out of nowhere, a solid wall of sand and grit that could strip the paint from a wagon and choke a man where he stood. "Cora, come back!" he roared, his voice nearly lost in the rising wind. "It is a storm." But she did not stop. She kept running, a small, defiant figure against the darkening sky. He sprinted to the corral, saddled his buckskin with frantic, clumsy hands, and rode after her. By the time he cleared the rocks around his cabin, the storm was upon them. The world disappeared. It was like being plunged underwater in a sea of dirt. The sun was gone, replaced by a suffocating brown twilight. The wind howled, a physical force that tore at his clothes and filled his eyes and mouth with choking grit. He could see nothing. He called her name until his throat was raw, but the sound was swallowed by the storm. He rode in the direction he had last seen her, his heart pounding with a terror that was cold and sharp. This was his fault. His cruel words, his fear, had driven her out into this. If she died out here, her blood would be on his hands. Another ghost to add to his collection. He searched for what felt like hours, his horse stumbling, the world a blind, roaring chaos. He was about to turn back, defeated, when Dog, who had run out with him, began to bark frantically off to his right. Eli turned the horse, following the sound. He found her curled at the base of a rock outcropping, a small mound almost completely covered by drifting sand. She was unconscious, her face pale and her lips cracked and blue. Her breathing was shallow, a faint, rattling sound in her chest. He leaped from the saddle, sweeping the sand away from her. He lifted her into his arms, her body limp and frighteningly cold. He remounted, holding her tight against his chest, and gave the horse its head, trusting the animal's instincts to find its way home. Back in the cabin, the world outside was still a howling nightmare, sand seeping through every crack in the walls. He laid her on his cot. She was shivering violently, her skin like ice, but when he touched her forehead, it was burning with fever. He worked like a man possessed. He stripped off her wet, sandy clothes and wrapped her in every blanket he owned. He built the fire up until it was roaring, the cabin becoming stiflingly hot. He forced sips of water between her lips, but most of it dribbled out. The fever took hold. She began to thrash, her arms and legs flailing, her eyes open but seeing nothing. She was delirious, trapped in the nightmares she had held at bay for so long. She started to murmur, fragmented whispers that cut him to the quick. The lock on the door, he turned the key, she mumbled, her hands clutching at the blankets. "Velvet, so heavy, cannot breathe." He tried to hold her still, to soothe her, but she fought him, a wild, terrified strength in her limbs. "Please, no," she begged the empty air. "Do not touch me. Smelled of brandy. His rings were so cold." To keep her from hurting herself, he did what he had to do. He ripped his own shirt into strips and gently, carefully, bound her wrists to the wooden frame of the cot. The act felt like a violation, but it was better than letting her break a limb. Her whispers continued, painting a picture of the wedding night she had fled, of a room, a locked door, and a man who believed he had bought the right to do whatever he pleased. The details she whispered, the fragments of memory that poured from her, shattered him. It was no longer a story. It was a violation he could almost see, almost feel. He lay down on the cot beside her, outside the blankets, pulling her shivering body against his own, trying to force his warmth into her. He held her through the long, terrible night as the fever raged, his own body aching with a helpless, protective fury. He listened to her broken whispers, and felt something shift inside him. The fear for his own safety, the ghosts of his past. They all burned away in the heat of her fever, leaving behind only one stark, undeniable truth. He would not let her go. He would not let anyone harm her again. If George Dandridge came, Eli would kill him. It was as simple and as absolute as that. Toward dawn, the fever broke, the wind died down, and a strange, heavy silence fell over the land. Her shivering stopped, replaced by a deep, healing sleep. He untied her wrists, his touch as gentle as he could make it. He sat in the chair by the cot and watched her, his face grim, his heart a heavy, aching weight in his chest. She woke late in the afternoon. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment they were clear and lucid. She looked at him, sitting there, his face haggard, his shirt torn. She remembered the argument, the storm, the choking darkness. She remembered running. "Eli," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. He was at her side in an instant, a cup of water in his hand. He lifted her head and helped her drink. The cool water was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She lay back, exhausted but calm. The terror was gone, washed away by the fever. She looked at him, at the raw concern in his eyes, at the lines of exhaustion around his mouth. He had not sent her away. He had come for her. He had brought her back from the edge of death. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, his touch tentative, questioning. And in that moment, all the arguments, all the fear, all the pride dissolved into nothing. There was only this man, and the profound, unspoken truth that he had saved her in more ways than one. She lifted a weak hand and touched his cheek, his skin rough with stubble. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch like a starving man offered bread. When he opened them again, the hunger was there, raw and unmistakable, but it was tempered with a deep, aching tenderness. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was nothing like their first, hesitant kiss on the porch. This was slow and deep and desperate. It was a kiss that tasted of dust and fear and a terrible, aching need. It was the kiss of two survivors clinging to each other in the wreckage. When he finally pulled away, they were both breathless. There were no words. There was no need for them. With a gentle strength that belied the urgency between them, he pulled back the blankets and slid onto the cot beside her. Their lovemaking was as slow and as desperate as their kiss, an exploration of aching bodies and wounded souls. He held her as if she were made of spun glass, his hands mapping the lines of her back, her hips, her shoulders. She clung to him, her fingers digging into his arms, anchoring herself to his solid, living warmth. It was a claiming, a silent vow made in the quiet aftermath of the storm. He held her like a man who had almost lost everything, like a man who knew he might lose her again, but who, in this one perfect, stolen moment, would not let her go. Afterward, as the last of the amber light faded from the sky, they lay tangled together under the blankets, Cora's head on his chest. The peace was fragile. Eli felt the old ghosts begin to stir. He looked at her, so fine and perfect in his arms, and the crushing weight of his own past descended. He was a killer, a man stained by war and violence. He was not worthy of this, not worthy of her. The guilt and doubt began to crawl back in, whispering their familiar poison in his ear. He felt himself begin to withdraw, to build the walls back up. Cora must have sensed it, the subtle shift in his body, the tension returning to his muscles. She lifted her head and looked at him, her blue eyes searching his face in the dim light. She saw the doubt there, the self-loathing he could not hide. She put her hand on his chest, right over his heart, as if she could physically hold him there.
"Please,"
she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion so powerful it was almost a prayer. "Please do not let me go. Not now. Not after this." Outside, the wind, which had been still for hours, began to pick up again. It moaned through the canyon, a low, mournful sound, like a warning of a storm yet to come. The quiet that followed the storm was a borrowed peace, and they both knew it. For 3 days, they lived within a fragile bubble of intimacy. Their world shrunk to the 4 walls of the cabin. They spoke little, but their movements were a conversation. The way he would watch her as she brushed her hair, the way she would place a hand on his arm as she passed him. The raw, desperate hunger that had brought them together was softening into a deep, steady current of tenderness. But every time a horse whinnied in the distance or a gust of wind rattled the door, they would both freeze, the illusion of safety vanishing, replaced by the cold certainty that the world was coming for them. It came on the 4th day. They were not subtle. 3 men rode into Whiskey Ridge, their horses fresh, their clothes expensive and out of place. They were not cowboys. They were city men, hard-faced and confident, the kind of men who carried the law in their pockets and a gun as an afterthought. Their leader was a tall, lean man with a neatly trimmed mustache and eyes as gray and cold as a winter sky. He introduced himself to Sheriff Galt as Mr. Barrows, an agent retained by Mr. George Dandridge. He presented a sheaf of papers, signed by an Eastern judge, detailing the abduction of one Cora Layton, a woman of delicate constitution and fragile mental state, by a known reprobate and ex-soldier of ill repute named Eli Ward. Sheriff Galt read the papers with a slow, savoring satisfaction. He was a portly man whose authority came more from his badge than his character. He and Eli had a history, a bitter feud that had started over a poker game years ago and had festered ever since. Fueled by Galt's jealousy of the respect and fear Eli commanded without ever asking for it, the papers Barrows presented were a gift. They gave him the legal cover to finally bring Eli Ward to heel. "Kidnapping is a serious charge," Galt said, his voice ringing with false gravity. "Especially a society lady from back east. Of course, Mr. Barrows, I will offer you the full cooperation of my office." An hour later, 4 riders crested the ridge overlooking Eli's cabin. Eli saw them coming. He had been splitting wood, and he stopped, the axe held loosely in his hand, his body going perfectly still. Cora, who was washing a pot by the door, followed his gaze. A knot of ice formed in her stomach. "Go inside," Eli said, his voice low and flat. "No," she replied, her voice trembling but firm. She wiped her hands on her apron and came to stand beside him. "I will not hide." Sheriff Galt rode in front, his chest puffed out. Barrows and his 2 men flanked him, their hands resting casually on the butts of their pistols. "Eli Ward," Galt called out, his voice booming with newfound authority. "I have a warrant here for your arrest, on the charge of kidnapping Miss Cora Layton." Eli did not move. He just watched them. His eyes narrowed. "You know that is a lie, Galt." "What I know," the sheriff said with a smirk, "is what this paper says. And it says you took this woman against her will. Now, are you going to come peacefully? Or do we have to do this the hard way?" Mr. Barrows dismounted, moving with a fluid, confident grace. He ignored Eli and addressed Cora directly, his voice smooth and condescending, as if speaking to a difficult child. "Miss Layton," he said, removing his hat. "My name is Barrows. Mr. Dandridge has sent me to escort you home. He is terribly worried about you. We understand you have been through a terrible ordeal." Cora's hands clenched into fists at her sides. The man's polite words were more menacing than any threat. "I am not going with you," she said, her voice shaking but clear. Barrows' smile did not waver. Of course. You are confused. It is to be expected. But that is of no consequence. Our instructions are to bring you back. Your fiancé is a very forgiving man." He turned his cold eyes on Eli. "However, his forgiveness does not extend to the man who took advantage of you in your delicate state. He will see you hang Ward." "She is not going anywhere," Eli said, his voice a low growl. He took a half-step forward, placing himself slightly in front of Cora. Galt's hand went to his gun. "Do not be a fool. Eli, it is 4 against 1. But Barrows held up a hand. "No need for violence. Sheriff, we have the law on our side." He looked back at Cora. "Miss Layton, if you force us to take you, Mr. Ward's fate will be sealed. However, if you come with us willingly, I am certain Mr. Dandridge can be persuaded to be lenient. Perhaps he will let the law forget about this unfortunate man altogether. The choice is yours." It was a perfectly crafted trap. He was using her to condemn Eli, forcing her to choose between her freedom and Eli's life. She looked at Eli, at the rigid line of his jaw, at the deadly stillness in his eyes. She knew he would fight. He would die right here, in the dust in front of his cabin, before he would let them take her, and his death would be her fault. The resolve that had been growing inside her for weeks finally solidified. Running was over. Hiding was over. She would not be a pawn in their game any longer. "Give me 1 day," she said, her voice ringing with a strength that surprised them all, even Eli. "1 day, and I will give you my answer tomorrow, in town, in front of everyone." Barrows considered this, a flicker of surprise in his cold eyes. He had expected tears, hysterics. He had not expected this. He looked at the hard faces of the townsfolk who had begun to gather on the edge of the street. Drawn by the spectacle, a public display might even serve his purpose better. "Very well, Miss Layton," he said with a slight bow. "Tomorrow at noon, on the church steps, we will await your decision," with a final, triumphant smirk at Eli. Sheriff Galt wheeled his horse around, and the 4 men rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy, suffocating silence in their wake. The moment they were gone, Cora's strength seemed to desert her, and she sagged against the doorframe. Eli was beside her in an instant, his hand on her arm. "What have you done?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. "You cannot face them alone." "I will not be alone," she said, looking up at him, her eyes fierce. "I have the truth. It is all I have left. I have let other people speak for me my entire life. My father, my fiancé. Tomorrow, I will speak for myself. I will not let them call you a kidnapper. I will not let them ruin you because of me." He saw the unshakable resolve in her face and knew that arguing would be useless. He had seen that look in the eyes of soldiers going into a battle they knew they could not win, but which they had to fight anyway. All he could do was stand with her. The next day at noon, the sun was a merciless hammer in a white-hot sky. Nearly the entire population of Whiskey Ridge had gathered in the dusty street in front of the town's small, weathered church. It was a motley crowd of miners, ranchers, and their wives, their faces curious and judgmental. Sheriff Galt and Barrows stood on the church porch, looking smug and confident. Cora walked through the crowd, Eli at her side. He did not touch her, but his presence was a solid, unwavering shield. She wore a simple dress she had mended herself. Her hair was pulled back, and her face was pale, but her head was held high. She mounted the 3 wooden steps and turned to face the town. A hush fell over the crowd. She began to speak, her voice at first a trembling whisper that was nearly lost in the vast, empty space. "My name is Cora Layton," she began, her eyes scanning the sea of faces. "Many of you think you know my story. You have heard the whispers. You have called me a ruined woman." A few of the men in the crowd snickered. Some of the women looked away, their face tight with disapproval. "You do not know the truth," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "The man you see beside me, Eli Ward, did not kidnap me. He saved my life." She took a deep breath, and then she told them everything. She spoke of her family's ruin, of the marriage that had been a business deal. She did not spare herself, laying bare the humiliating details of being sold like property. And then she spoke of George Dandridge. She did not raise her voice. She simply told the truth, her words falling like stones into the silent crowd. "He is a man who hides his cruelty behind a mask of respectability. she said, her voice shaking with the memory of it.
He threatened my family. He told me that a wife's purpose was to obey, and that he would teach me obedience. I ran because I was afraid, not for my reputation, but for my life.
Barrows, on the porch, let out a dismissive laugh.
These are the hysterical fantasies of a troubled young woman, he called out. She is unwell. Am I? Cora said, turning her burning gaze on him. Or am I simply the first woman who has dared to speak the truth about him in public?
She looked back at the crowd, her eyes pleading.
I collapsed at the edge of your town, half dead. Eli Ward found me. He took me in. He gave me shelter and asked for nothing in return. He has protected me. He is not the criminal here. The criminal is the man who has sent you here to drag me back to a life that is nothing more than a gilded cage.
The crowd murmured. The faces of the men were mostly hard, skeptical. But the women, something was different there. Cora saw them exchanging glances.
She saw a flicker of recognition, of understanding, in their eyes.
These were women who knew what it was to be powerless, to be at the mercy of a husband's temper or a father's decree. When she finished, a heavy silence hung in the air. For a moment, it seemed as though her words had changed nothing. Then, a man in the back jeered.
She is just a whore trying to save her lover's neck.
The spell was broken. A few others laughed. The tide of public opinion, which had wavered for a moment, seemed to be turning against them. Defeated, Cora turned to step down. But then a quiet voice spoke from the crowd.
She is telling the truth.
An older woman, a widow named Martha Gable, whose face was a roadmap of hardship, stepped forward. She was a respected figure in the town, known for her quiet strength. She looked not at the crowd, but at Cora.
You are not the first he has ruined, she said, her voice clear and steady.
She had known George Dandridge's first wife, years ago, before she had come west.
The woman had been a friend of her sister's.
His first wife, Eleanor. She was a beautiful, vibrant girl, and he broke her. We all saw the bruises she tried to hide. We heard the stories. She died of a fever before she was 25.
He is a monster.
A wave of murmurs swept through the women in the crowd. They looked at each other, and in their shared glances, a quiet, powerful rebellion began to stir. Another woman, the blacksmith's wife, nodded in grim agreement. Barrow's face had gone rigid with fury. Sheriff Galt looked uneasy for the first time. They had not counted on this. That night, a cold dread settled over the cabin. Cora's public stand had not saved them. It had only cornered their enemies. They both knew that Dandridge's men would not simply leave. They would find another way.
You should have let me handle them, Eli said, staring into the fire.
And what would you have done? Cora asked softly.
Killed them all? Been hung for murder instead of kidnapping?
She came and sat on the floor beside his chair, leaning her head against his knee.
We did the only thing we could do. We told the truth.
He placed his hand on her hair, his touch gentle. The truth does not always win. Cora. Later that night, long after Cora had fallen into an exhausted sleep, Eli was awakened by the sound of a horse in distress. It was one of his own, a high, panicked whinny coming from the corral. His instincts screamed that it was a trap, but he could not leave an animal to suffer. He pulled on his boots, grabbed his rifle, and slipped out the back door, moving like a shadow through the darkness. The night was moonless and quiet, too quiet. He made his way toward the corral, his eyes scanning the familiar rocks and trees. He found his mare. Her leg caught and twisted in a section of the fence that had been deliberately broken. As he bent to free the terrified animal, the world exploded in a flash of pain behind his eyes. He never saw them coming. There were at least 3 of them. A heavy blow from a pistol butt sent him sprawling. He tried to bring his rifle up, but a boot crashed down on his hand, and he heard the sickening crunch of bone. They were on him then. A flurry of kicks and punches. A brutal, merciless assault. They were not trying to kill him. They were trying to break him. The pain was a red wave. But he fought back. A silent, grim struggle in the dirt. He managed to get his hands on one man's ankle and twist, rewarded by a scream of pain. But there were too many of them. The last thing he remembered was a final, crushing kick to his head. And then, only darkness. Cora woke to the sound of silence. The rhythmic creak of the cot where Eli had been sleeping was gone. A premonition of terror, cold and sharp, shot through her. She lit a lamp, her hands shaking. He was not in the cabin. His rifle was gone. "Eli!" she called out, her voice a frantic whisper. Panic seized her. She grabbed the lamp and ran outside. The night was cold and still. She called his name again, louder this time, her voice cracking with fear. She ran toward the corral and saw the broken fence, the mare standing with her leg bleeding. And then she saw him. He was lying near the creek, half in and half out of the shallow water. He was a crumpled heap in the darkness. For a terrible, heart-stopping moment, she thought he was dead. She dropped the lamp and scrambled down the bank, her dress soaking in the icy water. "Eli!" she sobbed, turning him over. He was alive, barely. His face was a swollen, bloody mask. His shirt was torn, his chest and ribs a canvas of dark bruises. One of his hands was bent at an unnatural angle. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. A fierce, protective rage burned through her panic. They had done this to him. They had tried to destroy him because he had dared to stand for her. She would not let them win. Somehow, she found the strength. She was not a large woman, and he was a heavy man, but she managed to get her arms under his and drag him, inch by painful inch, out of the creek and up the bank to the cabin. The effort left her gasping for breath, her muscles screaming in protest. For the next 3 days, she did not sleep. Their roles were completely reversed. She was no longer the fragile patient. She was the fierce, determined nurse. She cleaned his wounds, her stomach churning at the sight of his battered body. She set his broken hand as best she could, binding it tightly with strips of cloth. She boiled willow bark to make a tea for the fever that set in, forcing the bitter liquid between his cracked lips. She sat by his side, bathing his face, whispering to him, begging him to wake up. She became his strength, his protector. On the 4th day, he opened his eyes. They were unfocused at first, clouded with pain and confusion. Then they cleared and found her face. "Cora," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. Tears of relief streamed down her face. "You are awake?" she breathed. Over the next few days, as his strength slowly returned, he was quiet, his eyes holding a new and profound darkness. He would watch her as she moved about the cabin, his expression unreadable. One night, as she was changing the bandage on his hand, he finally spoke. "I killed a man once," he said, his voice low and heavy. "During the war, not in battle. We had taken a small town, one of our own officers. A man drunk on power. He cornered a local girl in a barn. I heard her screaming." Cora stopped what she was doing, her hands stilling on his. She looked at his face, illuminated by the flickering lamplight. "I told him to let her go," Eli continued, his eyes focused on a past only he could see. "He just laughed. He said she was a spoil of war. He drew his pistol on me. So I shot him. I killed him to save her." He fell silent, the weight of the memory pressing down on him. "You did the right thing," Cora whispered. "Did I?" he said, a bitter twist to his lips. "The girl, she looked at me afterward, not with gratitude, with terror. She ran from me as if I were the monster, and my own men, they turned on me. I had killed an officer. They would have court-martialed me, hung me. I had to desert. I lost everything. My name, my honor, my country. All for nothing." He looked at her then, his eyes filled with a deep, haunting pain. "Every time I try to protect someone, I destroy them, or myself. I am stained. Cora, I bring ruin." Cora looked at the man before her, battered and broken, but whole in a way no one else had ever been. She saw past the scars, past the violence, to the core of him. She leaned forward, her heart aching with a love so fierce it was a physical pain. She held his bruised and broken face in her hands, forcing him to meet her gaze.
"I do not care what you have done,"
she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears.
"I do not care if you are stained. You are the only man who ever saw me. Not an arrangement, not a possession, not a ruined woman. You saw me."
She held him through the long, dark night, his head resting against her shoulder, his body still weak and aching. She held him as he finally, after 20 years, let go of the ghosts that had haunted him, his quiet, shuddering breaths, a testament to the weight he had carried alone for so long. She was his anchor in the darkness, and in healing him, she found the last, missing piece of her own strength. The arrival of George Dandridge was not an arrival at all. It was an occupation. He did not ride into Whiskey Ridge on a dusty trail horse. He arrived in a Concord coach, a gleaming black carriage pulled by 4 perfectly matched gray horses, an apparition of Eastern wealth and power that looked utterly obscene against the town's backdrop of peeling paint and sun-bleached wood. Dust settled on its polished leather and brass fittings. A temporary impurity the carriage seemed to shrug off with disdain. Dandridge himself emerged from the coach not like a man entering a new place, but like a king surveying a recently conquered and dissatisfying territory. He was dressed in a fine wool suit, his boots polished to a mirror shine, his movements precise and unhurried. He was handsome in a severe, sculpted way, his face a mask of genteel concern that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. Behind him, 2 more men disembarked, not the bounty hunter Barrows, but new men, larger and quieter, with the watchful, impassive expressions of professional guards. He did not go to the sheriff's office. He went directly to the saloon, requisitioning it as his personal headquarters. Word of his arrival spread through the town like a grass fire. This was him, the man Cora had fled, the source of the money, the power, and the fear. Eli, his hands still bandaged and his face a tapestry of fading yellow and purple bruises, felt Dandridge's presence like a change in the air pressure. He and Cora stood on the porch of the cabin, the news having been brought to them by Silas the blacksmith, who had ridden out the moment he saw the carriage.
"He is here,"
Cora whispered, her voice devoid of the terror he had expected. In its place was a strange, cold calm. The waiting was over. The monster was no longer a shadow on the horizon. It was here, in her world. "You are not facing him," Eli said, his voice a low command. "We ride out, now, north. We can be in the mountains by nightfall." She turned to look at him, her expression resolute. "And run for the rest of our lives, always looking over our shoulder? No, Eli, this ends here, in that town, one way or another." The summons came an hour later, delivered by a grim-faced deputy. There was to be a hearing, an inquiry into the health and safety of Miss Cora Layton. That afternoon, in the saloon, attendance was not optional. The saloon was packed. Every man in Whiskey Ridge who could stand seemed to be there, their faces a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and a base hunger for spectacle. The air was thick with the smell of stale whiskey, sweat, and sawdust. A long table had been set up at the far end of the room. Sheriff Galt sat in the middle, looking self-important and uncomfortable, a puppet keenly aware of the strings. George Dandridge sat to his right, calm and composed, the very picture of a wronged but benevolent fiancé. Barrows, the bounty hunter, stood behind him like a confident specter. Eli and Cora were given 2 chairs opposite them. The deck was not just stacked, it was a different game entirely. This was not a trial, it was a performance, and Dandridge was the director. Galt cleared his throat, banging a bottle on the table for silence. "This here is an inquiry," he announced, his voice straining for officialdom. "Mr. George Dandridge has come all the way from Boston out of concern for his betrothed, Miss Cora Layton. He has reason to believe she is not in her right mind and is being held against her will by certain parties. His eyes slid to Eli, heavy with malice. Dandridge rose, his movements smooth and commanding. He addressed the room, not the sheriff, his voice resonating with cultivated sincerity. "Gentlemen," he began, "I thank you for your time. This is a deeply personal and painful matter. My fiancée, Cora, has always been a delicate creature, prone to flights of fancy and bouts of melancholy. In the days leading up to our wedding, she suffered a profound mental collapse." He looked at Cora, his eyes filled with a perfect imitation of pity and sorrow. "She ran, not from me, but from her own imagined fears. She is unwell, a danger to herself. I have not come here to press charges or to seek retribution. I have come only to take her home, to see that she gets the medical care she so desperately needs." His words were a masterstroke of cruelty. He was painting her as a madwoman, erasing her agency, her voice, her truth. Everything she had said on the church steps was now reframed as the ravings of a lunatic.
"That is a lie,"
Cora said, her voice clear and cold in the silent room. Dandridge's expression of concern deepened. "You see," he said to the room, a sad shake of his head. "She is confused. The man who found her." He gestured dismissively toward Eli. "A man of known violent tendencies has clearly taken advantage of her fragile state. He has filled her head with these paranoid delusions to justify his own criminal actions."
"I will speak,"
Cora said, standing up. Her legs were trembling, but she locked her knees, refusing to show the weakness she felt. "My dear, you are not well enough to—" Dandridge began, his voice a silken trap.
"I will speak,"
she repeated, her voice louder, cutting him off. She looked at the faces of the men watching her, hard, skeptical, already convinced by the rich man in the suit. She knew she had to give them more than just her word.
Mr. Dandridge speaks of our engagement as a love affair,"
she said, her voice shaking but gaining strength.
"It was not. It was a contract. I have the letters."
She reached into a small satchel she carried and pulled out a thin bundle of papers tied with a ribbon.
"Letters between him and my father. They do not speak of love. They speak of stock prices, shipping routes,
and the exact financial settlement that would be made upon the completion of our merger, as they called it." She held them out.
"Is this the language of a concerned lover,
or a businessman closing a deal?" A murmur went through the room. Dandridge's composure wavered for the first time, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. "Business and marriage have always been intertwined. My dear, that is hardly proof of anything."
"Then perhaps this is—"
Cora said. She turned slightly, pulling up the sleeve of her dress to reveal her upper arm. Even in the dim light of the saloon, the bruise was visible, a dark, mottled stain on her pale skin. The faint, distinct outlines of 4 fingers and a thumb. "This is the mark he left on me 2 nights before the wedding, when I expressed my hesitation. He called it a gentle correction. He promised me there would be many more if I did not learn to be a more obedient wife." The room was silent. The sight of the bruise was a stark, physical reality that cut through the lies and legal papers. The men shifted uncomfortably. This was not something they could easily dismiss. Cora looked directly at the faces of the women who had gathered at the back of the saloon, their own husbands having forbidden them from entering, but their curiosity getting the better of them. She saw the blacksmith's wife, and Mrs. Henderson from the store, and others. Their faces were tight, their eyes wide.
"He tells you I am mad,"
Cora said, her voice ringing with a desperate clarity. "Is it madness to flee a man who bruises you before you are even wed? Is it madness to not want to be his property, to be corrected behind closed doors for the rest of my life?" Dandridge let out a short, sharp laugh. "A bruise? A lover's quarrel? My dear, you are reaching— This proves nothing but your own hysteria." Cora knew she was losing.
The men wanted to believe him. It was easier. The bruise was ugly, but a woman's hysteria was a familiar, dismissible story. She had one last card to play. It was a desperate gamble. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding. "There is someone else," she said, her voice dropping, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. "Someone in this town who knew his first wife." She turned her gaze to the back of the room, to the small, strong figure of the widow, Martha Gable, who stood just inside the doorway. "Mrs. Gable," Cora said, her voice pleading, "please, tell them." All eyes swung to the widow. Martha Gable froze, a deer caught in the glare of a lantern. She looked terrified. To speak against a man like Dandridge was to invite ruin. She could lose what little she had. She looked at the hostile faces of the men, at the cold, warning glare from Dandridge, at the sheriff, who was already shaking his head in dismissal. Then she looked at Cora. She saw the bruise on her arm. She saw the desperate, pleading hope in her eyes. And she remembered the face of another young woman, years ago. A girl named Eleanor who had hidden similar bruises and had spoken of a similar fear, and who had died of a fever, far too young. Martha Gable took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and took a step forward into the room. "His first wife was Eleanor," the widow said, her voice quiet but carrying in the dead silence. "She was my sister's friend, back in Philadelphia. She was full of life. When she married him, the light started to go out of her eyes." "This is irrelevant gossip," Barrows interjected, stepping forward. "Let her speak," a voice growled from the crowd. It was Silas, the blacksmith. Martha nodded her thanks to him. "Eleanor told my sister things," she continued, her voice stronger now. "That he had a temper, that he would lock her in her room for days. Once, my sister saw her at a garden party. Eleanor was wearing a high-necked dress on a hot summer day. A breeze came up and lifted the collar of her dress for just a second. There was a mark on her neck, a dark, ugly mark. When my sister asked her about it, Eleanor just started to cry and said she had been clumsy." The widow's eyes flashed with an old, cold anger. "Eleanor was never clumsy a day in her life. He beat her. We all knew it. We were just too afraid of him to do anything. And then, she was gone." A profound and uncomfortable silence fell over the saloon. This was not the testimony of a hysterical young woman. This was the quiet, damning word of a respected elder. Dandridge's face had become a mask of cold fury. The performance was over. Then, something remarkable happened. The blacksmith's wife, who had been standing beside Martha Gable, took a step forward to stand with her. Then another woman, the wife of one of the ranchers, did the same, and another. They did not speak. They simply moved from the shadows at the back of the room to stand in the light, a silent, resolute wall of solidarity. It was a slow, quiet, and terrifying rebellion. Sheriff Galt looked from the women to Dandridge's face, which was now radiating a murderous rage. He saw the hard, unreadable faces of the townsmen, who were now looking at Dandridge not with deference, but with a new, dawning suspicion. Galt was a coward, but he was not a fool. He knew which way the wind was blowing. The town was turning. He banged the bottle on the table again. Harder this time. This inquiry is over," he stammered. "There is no evidence of a kidnapping. Miss Layton is clearly of sound mind and is free to do as she pleases." He then turned his glare on Eli and Cora, his voice full of resentment for being cornered. "But I am warning you both. This town has no room for killers and ruined women. I suggest you pack your things and leave Whiskey Ridge for good." Dandridge said nothing. He simply gave Cora a look of pure, undiluted hatred, a look that promised a reckoning far beyond the laws of this dusty town. Then he turned on his heel and strode out of the saloon, his men following close behind. The crowd began to disperse, the men muttering amongst themselves, the women gathering around Martha and Cora, offering quiet words of support. Eli stood up, his battered face set in grim lines. He looked at the remaining men,
at Sheriff Galt, at the faces that had judged him for years. He stepped forward, and his voice, though quiet, cut through the murmurs. "Before you cast your stones," he said, his eyes sweeping over them, "before you call this woman ruined and me a killer, I want you to ask yourselves a question." He held their gazes, one by one. "Can any man among you look his wife in the eye tonight and call himself clean?" No one answered. Men shuffled their feet, looked at the floor, at the ceiling, anywhere but at him. The silence was his answer. He had held a mirror up to them, and they had not liked what they saw. Without another word, he turned, took Cora's arm, and led her out of the saloon into the harsh, bright sunlight. They walked back toward the cabin in silence. The adrenaline that had sustained Cora through the ordeal was gone, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. When they finally reached the porch, her legs gave out, and she sank onto the steps, burying her face in her hands. Sobs racked her body, not of fear or sorrow, but of a profound, shattering relief. The weight she had been carrying for so long, the fear, the shame, the secrets, it was all gone, laid bare for the world to see, and she had survived. Eli knelt in front of her, his hand resting gently on her back. He let her cry until the storm of emotion passed, leaving behind a quiet calm. She finally looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "Eli," she whispered, her voice raw. Would you still want me?" She looked down at her hands. "Now that everyone has seen me, all my secrets, all my broken parts, I am not the fine lady from Boston anymore. I am just this." He reached out and took her hands in his, lifting them to his lips. He kissed her knuckles, his touch full of a reverence that made her breath catch in her throat. He looked into her eyes, and in his gaze she saw no pity, no doubt, only a deep, unwavering certainty. "Cora," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "you are the only thing I have ever wanted whole." Eli's words settled over Cora, not just a promise, but a profound truth that healed the last of her broken places. In the days that followed, the weight of George Dandridge's presence lifted from Whiskey Ridge like a foul miasma, but the town itself remained a wound. The stairs, though no longer openly hostile, were still filled with a morbid curiosity. The silence that fell when they entered the general store was heavy with judgment. They were a spectacle, the killer and the ruined woman. Sheriff Galt's warning had not been a suggestion. It had been a declaration. They did not belong. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sky bleed into a soft, bruised purple, Cora voiced the thought that had been growing between them. "This is not our home," she said, her voice quiet but certain. Eli looked at her, his face still showing the faint shadows of his beating, but his eyes were clear. He had known this truth from the beginning. His cabin had never been a home. It had been a fortress, a place to hide from the world. But with her, for the first time in his life, he did not want to hide. He wanted to build. "No," he agreed, his voice a low rumble. "It is not—" "There is more land out there," she continued, gazing west toward the jagged line of mountains that clawed at the horizon. "Past the river, places where no one knows the name Layton or Dandridge, places where a man and a woman can make their own names." He looked at her, at the strength that had been forged in her, the resilience that shone from her eyes. She was no longer the frightened creature he had found in the mud. She was a survivor, a partner. She was his future. "Then we will go west," he said. It was not a question. It was a vow. Their departure was quiet and without ceremony. They had little to pack. They loaded one horse with supplies: flour, salt, coffee, an axe, a saw, and the blankets from the cot. Eli saddled his buckskin, and Cora took the gentle mare. As the sun rose, casting long shadows from the cabin that had been both her prison and her sanctuary, they rode out, not looking back. They were not fleeing, They were seeking. The country they passed through was wild, beautiful, and utterly indifferent to their survival. It was a land of harsh lessons and sudden violence. On the third day, a summer storm turned a dry creek bed into a raging, muddy torrent. The Eli of a month ago would have ordered Cora to stay back, to wait, but this Eli simply looked at her, and she nodded, her face set with determination. They urged their horses into the churning water side by side, the current pulling and sucking at the animal's legs. Cora's mare stumbled, and for a heart-stopping second, it seemed she would go under, but she did not scream. She held the reins with a steady, firm grip, spoke to the horse in a low, calming voice, and guided it through the worst of the current until its hooves found purchase on the far bank. She rode out of the water, soaked and shivering but with a triumphant light in her eyes. Another day, a large timber rattler, thick as a man's arm, coiled on the path ahead, its tail a dry, menacing buzz. Eli's hand went instinctively to his pistol, but Cora simply reined in her horse. She watched the snake with a calm, appraising gaze, a look of respect for a creature that was simply holding its ground. After a long moment, the snake uncoiled and slid silently into the tall grass. They rode on. Cora was no longer a visitor here. She was learning the land's rhythms, its dangers, and its unforgiving rules. She was becoming a part of it. They passed the ghosts of other people's dreams, abandoned camps with rusted skillets and rotted canvas, the lonely, leaning chimney of a burned-out cabin, a solitary grave marked by a pile of stones. Each one was a testament to the unforgiving nature of this life, a reminder of how easily a dream could turn to ash. Yet, it did not discourage them. It only hardened their resolve. At night, the world shrank to the small, warm circle of their campfire. The sky was a vast, dark ocean filled with a breathtaking spray of stars. It was in these quiet hours that they truly built their future, not with wood and nail, but with words and shared silence. "I have never belonged anywhere," Eli confessed one night, staring into the flames. "After the war, I just drifted. This land, it was a place to be alone. I never thought of it as a place to live. My family's house in Boston has had the Layton name on it for 100 years, Cora said, her voice soft. I was surrounded by history, by belonging, but I never felt it. It was a house, not a home. A home is not something you are given. I think it is something you have to make." He looked at her, the firelight dancing in her eyes. "What would we call our place?" he asked, the word are feeling new and strange and wonderful on his tongue. She smiled. "We will have to wait for the land to tell us its name," she said. "But I think it will be a good one." They found it 2 weeks later, in a high valley nestled between two protective mesas. It was an old ranch, long abandoned. The cabin was little more than a ruin. One wall of the corral had collapsed, and the well was choked with debris. Weeds grew waist-high in what had once been a pasture. It was a picture of failure, a place of sun-bleached bones and forgotten hopes. To Eli, it looked like a lifetime of hard work. To Cora, it looked perfect. "The bones are good," she said, running her hand over the solid, time-worn logs of the main cabin. "The water from the creek is sweet, and look." She pointed to the east, where the valley opened up, offering a view that stretched for 100 miles. "No one could ever fence us in here." And so, they began. They worked from sunrise to sunset, a partnership forged in sweat and determination. He taught her how to use a saw, how to drive a nail straight and true. Her hands, once soft and pale, became brown and calloused, and she wore the scratches and splinters as badges of honor. She taught him how to plan, how to look at the derelict cabin and see not what it was, but what it could be. She made sketches in the dirt, planning a new window here, a larger porch there. For the first time, Eli was not just surviving. He was building toward a tomorrow. They cleaned the well, hauling up buckets of mud and rock until they hit clean, cold water. They rebuilt the corral, setting new posts deep in the earth. They patched the roof of the cabin, and Eli, with a surprising skill. Rebuilt the collapsed stone chimney. They moved through their days in a rhythm of shared labor. Their movements so synchronized they often did not need to speak. A shared look, a nod, a gesture was all that was needed. They were building something from the ash of another's failure. And in doing so, they were rebuilding themselves. One night in late summer, the air grew heavy and still, thick with a tension that felt electric. The sky to the west turned a bruised, angry purple. They stood on the new porch they had just finished, watching the storm roll in. There was no rain, only a spectacular, violent display of dry lightning. Jagged spears of light tore through the clouds, striking the tops of the distant mesas with theatrical fury. Then it happened. A single blinding bolt struck the pine forest on the ridge just north of their valley. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a faint, orange glow appeared, a malevolent eye opening in the darkness. "Fire!" Eli breathed, the word a curse. The wind, which had been still, suddenly shifted, and a hot, dry gust swept down the valley toward them, carrying the scent of burning pine. The glow on the ridge brightened, spreading with terrifying speed. The world around them began to roar. There was no time for discussion, no time for fear. They moved as one. Eli ran for the horses, leading them to the relative safety of the creek bed. Cora grabbed buckets, the axe, and a pile of wet sacks they had prepared for just such an emergency. The fire was coming, a solid wall of flame cresting the ridge, embers the size of a man's fist carried on the wind, setting spot fires in the dry grass of their pasture. They were a tiny, insignificant force against a raging elemental god. But they fought with a desperate, synchronized fury. They beat at the spreading grass fires with the wet sacks, the heat scorching their faces, the smoke filling their lungs until every breath was an agony. They used the axe to cut a firebreak, a desperate, hopeless scar in the earth, hoping to slow the monster's advance. The heat was a physical blow, the noise a deafening, hellish roar. The world was reduced to fire and smoke and the frantic, pounding rhythm of their own hearts. They worked side by side, their faces black with soot, their clothes singed, their movements a frantic dance against annihilation. They were not fighting for a cabin or a corral. They were fighting for the future they had so painstakingly built, for the quiet peace they had earned, for the place where they finally belonged. Hours passed in a blur of smoke and terror. The main fire front raged past them to the south, a river of destruction. But the smaller fires in their valley were the immediate threat. They fought them until their muscles screamed, until their lungs felt scorched and raw, until they had nothing left to give. And then, as if by a miracle, the wind shifted again. A cool, damp breeze began to blow in from the east, pushing the flames back on themselves. The roar began to subside, replaced by the crackle and pop of dying embers. The immediate danger had passed. They stood in the center of their blackened pasture, two small, exhausted figures in a world of ash. The cabin, miraculously, was untouched, but the land all around them was a charcoal ruin, smoking and desolate under the first pale light of dawn. Cora looked at the devastation, at the scarred earth, and a tremor went through her. They had almost lost it all. The fragile safety, the home they had built with their own hands, had almost been turned to cinders. The thought of it, the sheer, terrifying randomness of the destruction, broke through her exhaustion. She turned and threw her arms around Eli, clinging to him with a desperate, shuddering force. The terror she had held at bay during the fight now consumed her. It was not the fire she was afraid of. It was the thought of losing this, of losing him. "Please," she begged, her voice a raw, broken whisper against his soot-stained shirt. "Please do not let me go, not ever." Eli wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, his own body trembling with exhaustion and a profound, aching love. He looked out at the burned world around them, at the devastation. And then he looked down at the woman in his arms. the anchor of his life. He had walked through the fire, and she had been there beside him, his last ghost. The fear that he was a man who brought only ruin turned to ash and blew away in the morning breeze. "Cora," he said, his voice rough and thick with emotion. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "Even if I burn, I will hold you." The sun finally crested the eastern mountains. A new day. Golden light poured into the valley, illuminating the smoke that still hung in the air, catching the glint of the water in the creek, and turning the blackened, scarred earth into something strangely beautiful, like a landscape of dark velvet. In the center of it all, two shadows stood close, their hands clasped together. They were survivors. They were lovers. They were, at long last, finally free. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know where you are tuning in from in the comments to connect with fellow listeners. And remember to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.